Welcome back, everyone. I'm Peter Haak, senior technology reporter at Politico. We had a very Brussels-centered morning. After that, we heard from the US Senator how things are faring in the US, and now we're back for a very global afternoon to say. We will take stock of the global discussion around AI, because in recent years, we've seen that the global conversation around AI has shifted from trying to rein in the technology, really looking at the safety and security aspects, to rather trying to win the global AI race and having the right infrastructure to do that. And that, of course, begs to ask the question, is this the end of the famous Brussels effect, where the idea that Brussels is making the rules and everyone else is following them? We will discuss that with three esteemed speakers we have here. First of all, we have Audrey Planck, the Deputy Director of Science, Technology and Innovation at the OECD. Welcome. We have Juha Heikkilä, Advisor on International Aspects of AI at the European Commission. And finally, we have Asim Anwar, the First Secretary at the Embassy of India here in Brussels. Welcome all. This will also be a session with Q&A. So if you have a question, please prepare it well. No lengthy remarks, no lengthy statements. We'll dive right into it now. And I want to start with you, Mr. Anwar, because of course the year kicked off with something big in New Delhi in India. I was there myself, it was quite something. It was of course the India AI Impact Summit. It really dominated the global discussion around AI. India really made a push with the Impact Summit to ensure that AI has impact, that it's kind of a democratic technology, that it is accessible to everyone. But I'll let you maybe do the pitch and give us a bit of an overview of what the result and the outcome was of this summit.
Sure. Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon to everyone. And I think I must say that I would like to thank Politico for organizing this extremely important event and focusing on AI governance. So to come back to your question, on what India managed to achieve during the Impact Summit, which was held in February. I think there were three main achievements which were very demonstrable. But before that, of course, the scale of the event itself, and as Peter, you mentioned, you were there. We managed to bring in more than senior representatives from more than 80 countries. More than 20 heads of state were there, and we also got the Indian population interested in AI. More than 500,000 people participated in various side events that were held along with the summit. We also had many pre-summit events held all over the world, including a few in Brussels, and I'm sure many in the audience would have attended some of these events. But coming back to the summit itself, I think the most important success of the event was to bring in the story of the Global South. Now, we always hear about AI, the perspective of what is the US approach versus the EU approach or the Chinese approach. But a lot of times, the voice of what we call the Global South, or for those who are not familiar with that term, I'm referring to the emerging economies, of course, those voices are a bit lost. And what India did was to make sure that we bring in the voice of the Global South to make AI, as you said, more inclusive and democratic. We had 7 working groups as part of the summit, and every working group was co-chaired by one country from what you would refer to as the Global North or the developed world, and one from the Global South, so that the voice of these countries, the emerging economies, were heard. The second big achievement, I would say, was to focus on impact, as the name itself suggests. A lot of the previous summits, the AI summits which have been held in UK, France, and Korea, I think the focus was a lot on safety, environment, security. I think we wanted to focus a little bit more on the outcomes and the deliverables. So we called it an Impact Summit, and the idea was to see how it can affect the lives of the common public, which of course...
But the way you phrase it, you say like the others were more about safety and security, now it was more about impact, so that suggests that this one was also less about safety and security. Is that true?
I wouldn't say that at all, as one of the working groups itself talks about trusted AI and safe AI. So safety was still there. Energy efficiency was still there as one of the working groups.
Safety wasn't mentioned in the final declaration.
Yeah, see, now the thing is, the declaration, and that's the third achievement I would like to talk about, was we were able to have a declaration that was agreeable to all.
Yeah.
More than 90 countries endorsed the agreement, the EU, of course, and all the 27 member states, US and China, and all the others. So they all endorsed it. So the idea was to have a declaration that was acceptable to everyone. So what we did is we played the role of a consensus builder.
Yeah.
So it took in ideas which are the perspectives of all these major players to make sure that we were able to bring in consensus which is acceptable to everyone.
Yeah.
I think that was the main objective which we were able to achieve.
I want to bring that to you maybe. From the point of the OECD does a lot of AI governance and policy monitoring. I hear someone saying like, okay, the thing that is globally acceptable at the moment is no safety mention at all. Do you have the feeling that that is showing as well in your monitoring work? Apparently safety is not on the table anymore.
I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
I think safety is a really important topic, and so is security. I think the prior panel, you even heard the senator talk about the criticality of security. I think in the monitoring that we do at the OECD, we look at jurisdictions around the world and what kind of policies they're developing. And we see safety and security are spread throughout those policies broadly across the world. I think what you're hearing from India, not to put words in your mouth, but we partnered very closely with India on the summit, is that there's also a geopolitical aspect of this discussion, and the moment in time in which certain things happen allow certain words to be used and other words maybe not to be used. But I don't think it at all undermines the importance in which India put on safety in the summit, and in which we see all OECD member countries and the more than 80 jurisdictions, including the EU, that we cover and that we work with on AI, focusing on safety.
Yeah. From the Commission side, what do you think of the fact that safety didn't make it into the final declaration? Because for the EU, of course, safety, the risk-based approach, and the governance of AI has been a very important talking point as part of the AI Act, but also as part of the international outreach. So what do you make of that?
I wouldn't make too much out of it, because as was stated by both Asim and Audrey, safety still features in the discussions. It's not the case that we have focused on safety before and now we don't focus on safety at all, but focus on other things. I think what is characteristic of these summits, if you look at them, and of course it's not a sort of centrally organized set of events. It's completely organic. Whoever wants to hold one will hold one. But basically what is characteristic after the first two is that the scope has been expanded. So this was already the case in Paris, even more so now in India. And if you go back and look at the Paris summit and the Indian summit now compared to the first two, you will see that the scope is now far, far wider, and it includes many other aspects, but it does not exclude safety, and safety certainly features in our discussions all the time, but we are not the only ones in this regard.
The face of the summit's also kind of changing, because, for example, if I compare to Paris last year, Commission President von der Leyen did a big speech there. We had all the major leaders there. J.D. Vance was there, von der Leyen. This year it was a bit different, because, for example, von der Leyen didn't attend. Executive Vice President Virkkunen was there, but she didn't really have a major speaking slot. Is that saying something about the role of the EU, or was it more like, let's leave the spot to the global South?
Well, I mean, we had a very high-level delegation there led by the Executive Vice President, as you said, and she had a prominent role there. We also had an active role in the summit and in supporting the summit. We had two sessions which we organized, which had speakers from different parts of the world. We also made announcements there. For example, in particular, I would like to highlight the thing that we announced about the EU-India Legal Gateway Office as a pilot project, which will facilitate talent mobility. So this is quite a significant, concrete thing that we announced. So certainly our presence was very, very significant there. I would not put it on a lower level than it was at Paris, regardless of who represented us, and it was a very high-level representation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What was your feeling on that front? Because the Paris summit was already a bit going to the direction of striking deals and announcing big investments. How did India want to strike that balance on that end? Is it really like, did you want to avoid that it becomes like an industry trade fair? And how do you perceive that, or how do you preserve that label of still a summit where other topics can be discussed as well?
Yeah, just to come back to what the previous question you posed, I must say that the president of the commission was in India just 15 days before the summit, and where the FTA was announced, and you had a big summit where a lot of concrete actions were decided, including on technology and AI as part of the India-EU Trade and Technology Council. So I wouldn't say that the EU's voice was less heard as compared to before. It was, in fact, amplified because we had a summit just before the AI event. Coming back to your question, I think, yes, we did strike a balance. And as I mentioned, that what our summit achieved was to talk about, of course, the human-centric aspect, but you had a lot of companies, most of the big tech companies were represented at the CEO level. The Prime Minister himself addressed an event which had all the CEOs there. A lot of investments were committed into India's AI industry. We are, of course, investing a lot, focusing on increasing our own GPU capacity and so on. So what we did was, of course, a balance. We brought in that perspective of listening to, of course, leaders from various parts of the world. But at the same time, the industry perspective was there. So I don't think there was any significant departure on that front from the previous summits.
Mm-hmm. What struck me during the summit is that when French President Emmanuel Macron was attending the world leaders and the CEOs, he also focused on the issue of minor protection. And I've already seen that the G7 presidency of France will also focus on minor protection, also a bit about deepfakes. And I was wondering to what extent, and that's maybe a question for you, Audrey, to what extent do you think that countries or regions try to look at AI governance through a certain lens, and maybe this is then the lens that France wants to use is protection of minors, or maybe deepfakes? Is that something where you see, like, if, for example, something like the whole saga around Grok happens, that countries are reacting to that on AI governance through a specific lens?
Well, I think, I don't know if it's working, the mic, yeah? Okay, so the countries are, governments are always going to be, and policy is always going to be a little bit behind the technology. So in that regard, we're always a little bit reactive. I think our job as policymakers and as people that support policy is to try to foresee that. And I think with regard to children, the G7 is looking at children through the lens of AI, but not only. They're also looking at, the trend of social media regulation and how governments are implementing that. And so we happen to support the G7, and so happen to be very familiar with those discussions. And so I can say that they're definitely looking at how AI is impacting all these various different aspects of technology, diffusion, as we call it, or adoption and development, and different communities that it's affecting, in this case, children. But it's not only about AI and children. I think from the G7's perspective, it's also trying to say, how do we protect children more broadly across the entire digital ecosystem? But I do think that AI is as it infiltrates every sector of the economy, and it will at different rates. And the data shows that certain sectors are way ahead in terms of adoption. Other sectors are further behind. Manufacturing tends to be a slower adopter. Healthcare sort of in the middle, and the ICT sector is way ahead. But there's a huge amount of room for growth and adoption of this technology. And as it comes in, it's going to have an impact on across these sectors, on both the whether it's from an employment and labor perspective, or whether it's from a sort of education perspective with regard to how kids are educated, or whether it's from how your healthcare is delivered to individuals. AI will be completely transversal and horizontal across that. And so inevitably governments will look at it through those lenses, I think. And you'll see, and I think the approaches across the jurisdictions and countries that we work with show that policy approaches differ. Some are very sectoral in nature, some are more omnibus or more cross-cutting, like the EU approach. But at the end of the day, everybody's struggling and will struggle with the same challenges.
Yeah. If you speak about the labor market, that's of course something that everyone is watching at the moment. Leading up to the summit in the beginning of the year, we had, for example, Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei warning about the impact that tools like Claude Code could have, even for just one vertical, software development, but also the wider labor market. When I was in India, it really struck me that Indians are really like, let's go all in on this, really with an optimistic tone, while here in Europe and in the West, we're maybe a bit more concerned. There is fear that AI will displace jobs. I want to hear from both of you. How do you have to address that? How do you have to address the optimism, but also the fear among citizens around AI? So I'm not sure who wants to.
I'll go first. Yes, you're absolutely right, because given India's own development trajectory, we are targeting to be a developed country by 2047. That gives us a little more than 20 years. And innovation is at the heart of our development journey. And what the leadership of the country's decided is, of course, we adopt AI wholeheartedly towards this journey. Given our own strengths in STEM fields, we, of course, everyone knows about our strengths in technology. And we are focusing on developing the full stack of AI. So we are investing in capacity building. We, as I already mentioned about our investment in GPUs, to target about 100,000 capacity by end of this year. We have several thousand postgraduates and PhDs we are targeting in the field of AI. So our focus, and that also comes from our regulatory approach and our governance approach, is innovation first, which is perhaps a little different from what some of the other geographies, including EU, has focused on. But that innovation is still going to be very human-centric, with due regards to safety and other concerns as well. So I think, yes, there's a lot of adoption on innovation, how it's going to impact everyone, given that we have a large population, 1.4 billion, that needs to be trained in AI and needs to adopt AI. But of course, with due regards to the concerns which, of course, let's say the EU AI Act perhaps talks about.
What is the EU's perspective on this? Because I always find it there is not a lot of talk in Brussels about AI in the labor market. What do you make of that?
So actually, it is an aspect that we address in a number of ways. In particular, I would like to highlight the Apply AI strategy, where skills is one of the key components. So this was already raised in the AI Continent Action Plan a year ago, and it was then further strengthened. And this is something we've been looking at for a longer time, but this is certainly something that we feel is necessary to see what kinds of skills we need in the future. And so both in order for people to be able to cope with AI and to be able to then address the labor market changes. I think the one big question here is we simply don't know yet what the impact will be. And in some respects, this is a deja vu, because already like 10 years ago, I was sitting on panels like this where this came up. And I think it's also very important to demystify and have factual information based on which we can then take conclusions and take action. And I think at the moment the jury is out still.
Is there already some kind of factual information inside the Commission about the impact on the labor market?
Well, I'm not working directly on this, but we have kept an eye. The OECD might have actually more information about this because they are working more directly on this.
So yeah. The question is yours then.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. So I'll give a recent example. Just a few weeks ago, we had our annual conference on work, AI and work, innovation and skills. And it's an initiative that Germany started at the OECD several years ago. And I think there's a lot of interesting data coming out on different labor market impacts. I would say the jury is still out in terms of the aggregate. Like there's probably unlikely to be a point in which we're like, it's a net positive or a net negative. But in reality, what we're seeing is that there's certain populations at risk. But we also see that AI is also augmenting and enhancing capabilities of the workforce in other places. And so that's to be watched. It's also different across industries and different across geographies. And so it sort of depends on how you slice the data. I will say that because this is such an important topic, and I mean, if you read any major news outlet, you'll see that, like, companies around the world now are saying, we're going to lay a bunch of people off because we have AI coming. But I think in reality, the data, isn't as clear about that yet. But it doesn't mean we don't have any information. And I think one thing to watch forthcoming is our employment outlook from the OECD coming out next year. We'll focus exclusively on AI in the labor market and try to unpack these dynamics a bit. And somebody in the prior panels, I think it was the senator, was talking a little bit about what we call sentiment analysis, so how people feel about it. And we've done our labor part of the OECD has done some studies on surveying employees about their sort of views on AI, and I think you get a very mixed picture depending on culture. As you say, the West is, tends to be a little bit more negatively perceiving of impact. You go to other countries like India, and there's a much more of a positive impact, a sentiment around the possibility of AI to have a positive impact on people's work life. And so we're really interested in breaking out that correlation of how, what are the broad trajectories macro on the labor market, but also in specific disciplines and specific industries, how people are being affected. We know it's upending education, for example. We know that I think without any doubt, every policy we see across everybody that we work with, there is a focus on upskilling and reskilling a population, because it is, I think, goes without saying that everybody's going to need to learn to use these tools regardless of what discipline or what industry they're working in. And so massive amounts of government focus in that, as I think our recommendations say they should be focused on.
One area that AI is also upending is warfare. We've seen with the war in Iran that there was mention of course, AI systems being used to envision certain targets. I was wondering, there has been a UN effort to look at AI and warfare for a while now. There is no consensus to move forward on anything binding or even non-binding. I was wondering to what extent it was, of course, before the Iran one started, but can you say, was this a topic at the summit? Is this something where you or where India has tried to make some progress on, making sure that AI and warfare, that happens in an ethical way?
I mean, to be honest, at the summit, I'm not sure if this came up in a big way. I definitely know that there was no specific theme at the summit that spoke about AI, application of AI in defense and warfare. But I think it's a reality. Everyone has seen, we are seeing the news every day, and I think it's for the whole world to sort of decide and discuss. And that's the approach which the summit provided. Focus on multilateralism. Not just on AI and its governance, but the application of this of AI. And I think that kind of multilateral approach is what we need to discuss sensitive topics such as the use of AI in warfare. And I think that's what India would also encourage and adopt in its discussions, at a global level.
Mm-hmm. Is this something where the EU is also actively pushing for? I know that some EU countries have weighed in on that effort at the UN level, but for the EU it's a bit more difficult, of course, because you have no national security competencies.
Well, exactly. So our competence in that particular area is in the member states, and we have very limited room for maneuver in that regard. But of course, that is a discussion that we are following and seeing where it leads, and there are some forums where perhaps I understand this is discussed in the UN context, but this is then obviously also by the UN members, and of course the EU is not a UN member, but we do follow this very closely. I think we don't need to go to the latest conflict in Iran. We see it already for the past few years. Of course, Ukraine has very successfully been able to deploy AI to defend itself from the Russian aggression. And with the help of AI, we have seen this very clearly, and probably that has played quite a significant role in many respects.
I want to go back to Davos, where Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said, okay, the middle powers of this world should maybe team up. We've seen that maybe also happening on the field of AI? Because you already mentioned that US and China, you wanted to position yourself as the alternative, the global south alternative. But I just also want to know, like, to what extent with the US maybe saying, like, no, we don't want any AI regulation or talks about AI safety, is there any chance for the middle powers of this world to come together on things like AI governance and AI safety? Is that something that you've seen at the summit or afterwards, that there are now new alliances on this topic?
No, I think coming specifically to AI governance, I think India's view is, fairly clear that at least domestically, we have the recommendation is not to have a standalone law that focuses on AI. I think a more democratic and voluntary approach is what India has talked about in the summit, and that's perhaps where I think the consensus will emerge, as we saw in the declaration that the governance of AI should be voluntary in some way. At least that's what we have espoused. Specifically talking about safety, yes, safety forms an important part of the narrative because there is an AI safety institute that India has set up, and we are of course closely working with the EU as part of the TTC on collaboration between with what the EU has through its AI office. So safety is very much part of the narrative. On governance, it's a bit more of a light touch approach and focusing more on voluntary and sort of a collaborative governance than a more legal or a law-based governance approach, which let's say the EU has adopted.
But does that mean, if we then look at the Brussels effect, the EU has this AI law, but I hear then that not a lot of other countries are following it, that legal approach. Do you see that in the global mapping, in the global map, that this is maybe not something that is followed widely?
Well, it depends. I think you have some countries that have, like Brazil's a great example of a country who's sort of the closest, I think, aligned. It's not a final law yet, but if you look at the law pending in Brazil, it's the most, sort of closely aligned to the EU specifically. But there are others, like the Peruvian Declaration is drawn heavily from the EU AI Act. And then there's a lot of countries that have drawn pieces of it. I would say a lot of OECD countries, the UK, Japan, others. And so I don't think of it as a binary thing. And I actually think that the concept of a risk-based approach is very widely accepted across all jurisdictions, the US included, and even countries that might take a more, light touch approach, as you put it, are still taking a risk-based approach, and they're thinking about it in terms of risk. So I think from that perspective, the AI Act and the EU approach has had very wide and very broad impact in how countries think about it. Countries are all different. They all have different jurisdictional, legal systems in which they make laws and do policies. And so how that manifests is, it may not look exactly the same, but we see a lot of coherence and borrowing from that, from the EU approach, if you want to call it that. But I do think that this idea of managing risk and looking at the technology through a risk lens is also not new in the technology world, and we've used it in a lot of different domains. And I think from that regard, the EU has had a huge impact on almost every jurisdiction.
We can declare the Brussels effect
you
not dead.
You agree with me, yeah?
Yeah, I do agree with you. I mean, I can even go into more detail. And if you look at the three other laws that are in the books, so I'm thinking of Korea, Vietnam, and Taiwan.
Yeah,
they are very, very similar to the EU AI Act. So they all have this kind of risk-based approach as the basis. They may call it slightly different, like I think the Korean law talks more about impact, high impact, rather than high risk. But when you scratch the surface, it looks very similar. We have, of course, very lively exchanges with our Korean colleagues about it. Vietnam, Taiwan, also, they have a very similar approach. So there is this core which has clearly been influenced by what we have done. Also, Brazil, you mentioned already, Audrey, that's indeed the case. We see this kind of echo elsewhere as well. They may not be in the books. I understand Indonesia is developing something as well. So we do have examples of this, so that the resonance has actually been quite remarkable, because if you look at it, when we published the AI Act first, the draft 5 years ago, and then when it was adopted, there's been an enormous amount of interest just to discuss it and see whether agreeing or not agreeing, but still it has put this whole question about regulation and governance on the agenda so firmly that it cannot really be ignored. What you think about it is another matter, but this involves not just countries, but also companies and civil society organizations which exchange about this and come to talk about us about it. They want to hear more about it. So,
and the fact that the EU is already rolling back some of those rules doesn't influence?
We're not rolling back
power?
Some of those rules. What we are doing is, of course, we are trying to ensure that the implementation is smooth and that the AI Act can be then complied with in a smooth manner. That is, of course, a very important part of the legislation which is not workable is not very good, of course, and we want to make sure that it is as good as possible in terms of helping the stakeholders to comply with the provisions of the AI Act.
Can I just say that it feels to me like, having been in this space for a really long time, that what we really all want to be focused on is outcomes here, and the outcomes are, we'll get there in different ways, and different strategies will get there in different ways. But like, what are we focused on trying to achieve? And I think we're, there's a few things that most everybody agrees on. One is that this technology is transformative, and it's going, if economies are going to grow, they need to adopt it, but they need to adopt it in a trustworthy, responsible way. What that means and what we need to put in place from a collaborative perspective to do that is an ongoing discussion. We'll have to evolve with the technology. So, for example, you mentioned the safety institutes, and you asked, is there a global, are there places where the global South is coming together? Are there different, cooperation mechanisms coming in place, in light of the sort of standoff between the US and China and whomever? I think the answer to that is yes, but it's not this binary, it's all or nothing, situation. So, for example, when we were in India, one of the, what I think big things that India did during the summit was host the council meeting of the Global Partnership on AI, which India chaired several years ago. It's an initiative that brings the Global South and the developing world to the table with OECD countries and others to work on AI, but not just from a, our regulation is better than your regulation, or our policy objective is better than your policy objective, but, how do we do responsible deployment of AI in healthcare and in agriculture in very concrete ways that countries can work together on, broadly speaking, governance, but with the same objective of, moving this technology through the process of development into adoption in a way that benefits economies and societies and people.
I see. If I may add just one thing, which was mentioned by the senator. I didn't hear the whole talk, but he mentioned the word trust, and I think that is the key here. I was glad to hear that, because this has been kind of the driving thing. Because if you don't have trust, you don't have adoption of this technology. If you don't have adoption, you don't have the benefits either.
I've seen a very fierce defense of the Brussels effect here. Let's turn to Q&A. So if you have a question, we will have two roving mics. I see there is one on the side there. Yes. Please stand up and state your name and if there is a microphone somewhere. Yes. And please, a question, not a statement.
Yeah, Didier Cornell, I'm a volunteer for Pose AI. I'm kind of surprised that nobody here speaks about existential risk related to AI. So you probably know that Bernie Sanders in the US just met a specialist of AI in China and in the US. You probably know that the more quoted scientist in the world, Yoshua Bengio, is speaking about that. And you all know that there were big problems concerning Mythos, and as far as I know, no reaction at the European level, and as far as I know, for the 40 companies who had access to Mythos, no European company. So what about what is doing Europe concerning really a catastrophic risk that could happen? And how is it possible that at the moment, the classical sentence, it's easier to sell a sandwich than it's more complicated, to sell a sandwich than to have a new software who could be dangerous for humanity.
So what is the EU doing?
Less rules.
existential and catastrophic risks of AI?
So maybe 2 points to make in this regard. So first of all, yes, we do discuss this, of course. I mean, this is included in our AI safety work, of course. Certainly, this is something that is on the agenda. The other point I want to make as well is that experts do actually disagree about to what extent this is an imminent risk or to what extent it's something that is going to be there in, let's say, 5, 10 or years or sooner or later. So it's, yes, there are very influential and highly esteemed voices which are of this opinion that it is a very significant risk and an imminent risk, but there are others who do not necessarily agree. It doesn't mean that we don't discuss it. Of course we do, because it is something we have to take into account. And of course, as regards Mythos, we are talking to the company as well. We have channels open. They have informed us of the model as part of the obligations under the AI Act, but also as a company which has signed up to the Code of Practice for General Purpose AI Models. So in that sense, we have these discussions going on all the time, and of course with other providers as well. This is not the only model out there, so there have been other models which have come out since, which are also very powerful.
Does that mean that you're also speaking to OpenAI about their newest model? And
we are talking to all the providers who are relevant, of course, and this is part of our ongoing work, which of course is not something that we publish in the newspapers all the time, because it is very sensitive also in many regards.
Okay.
Can I just say that this is why the work of Dr. Bengio and the panel is very important, because it's a unique format, and I know, I think the EU participated, I don't mean to speak for you, but we certainly did on the panel to feed into the report on AI safety that came out right before the India summit. We also have our own work at the OECD on what we call AI futures, or sort of foresight, looking ahead. We published some work on that also before the summit in conjunction with Dr. Bengio's report and the work, excellent work out of Mila. And I think that work, it's very important that that work continue, because convening that community together for all the reasons that you had just said, that there isn't, core consensus on a moment in time in which, we might see this, but whatever this is, but that dialogue and discussion and the putting out the evidence of what is available for us to understand is critically important. And so I just want to...
Isn't that work also under pressure? Because you mentioned indeed that some countries are adopting the EU approach. We've seen some mirroring in the AI Safety Institute in India. But of course, the big question is, the US is not playing along. China neither. What's then the real impact of this? And is that work indeed under pressure, as these players are saying, we don't play along?
They don't, both the US and China have safety institutes. India does, the EU does. They all work together. I think the playing along is
also something on Mythos. Can, for example, this network of institutes really come to the table and say, okay, let's discuss Mythos?
I hope they do.
Do they?
Well, we do have contact with the other safety institutes, or security institutes, as they are called in some countries. There is actually a network. It's a bit of a mouthful, the name now. It's called NAIMS. It's NAIMES. It used to be called the Network of AI Safety Institute, but it was changed recently. And this is quite close technical cooperation. Yeah. So in a multilateral cooperation. But in addition, we also have bilateral talks, particularly with say, the UK Institute, the Singapore Institute, Japan. So we have these exchanges going on.
Will Mythos be on the agenda of the next meeting of the network?
I haven't seen the agenda, but quite possibly. I don't know.
Yeah, it's in a few weeks.
Quite possibly, yes. Here?
Yeah, quite possibly, yes.
Okay.
I don't think either of us have seen it, but I think the next meeting is happening at the end of the month.
Okay, and we understand that quite possibly, yes, they're going to discuss Mythos. Maybe another question? Yes, there. Very quickly, very short, because we are running out of time.
Well, yeah, to be honest, as I said, AI is one of those areas where I think we have very close cooperation with the EU as part of the Trade and Technology Council. Even during the summit, when the leaders of both the Commission and the Council visited India in January, and the FTA, for example, was signed, If you see some of the statements that came out, AI is very much there. As one of the areas where the two sides can work very closely, because fundamentally the values are similar. I mean, we have similar values. Our views on AI as something that is human-centric and has to be trustworthy, that aligns perfectly. And I think given our overall cooperation in general, which covers a lot of areas, I think there is a learning that can happen both ways. And I mentioned earlier about the AI Act. I must say that just because India does not have an act doesn't mean that we have not drawn from the EU experience. So, for example, the risk-based approach is there in our governance setup. It's just that we are using existing laws in India on IT and data protection to implement some of these regulations. So similarly, we feel that EU can also benefit from our approaches. The Legal Gateway Office, for example, which talks about skilling and mobility of tech professionals from India to Europe, is an area where I think AI will also be a big beneficiary, AI cooperation between the two sides. So I think, yes, there is a lot of scope in that area.
Okay. Thanks for those questions, and I'm afraid we are almost running out of time, so we will have to wrap up this very insightful discussion about global AI governance. I keep in mind that the Brussels effect is not that, or at least that we have very fierce defenders of it here, and that quite possibly Mythos will be on the agenda of the next meeting of the Network of AI Security and Safety Institutes. Up next, stay seated, because we will have my colleague Elisa Gritschke moderating a panel on the future of EU's digital platform laws. After a quick stage change, I want to thank my panelists for being here with me. Thanks.